Welcome to Critical Conversations, a Latinx learning series powered by the Ford Foundation and the Latinx House. Today's episode is the future of work in the Latinx community. And now, welcome the co-founder of the Latinx House, Mónica Ramirez.
Hello and welcome to Critical Conversations, a Latinx learning series presented by the Ford Foundation and the Latinx House. My name is Mónica Ramirez and I'm one of the co-founders of the Latinx House. The Latinx House is a home base for people who appreciate, support, and celebrate the excellence of the Latinx, Latine community. Today's episode, The Future of Work in the Latinx Community, is our fourth conversation in this series. This topic is particularly important to me. I've spent my entire career fighting for the rights of workers in our country. And we, along with the Ford Foundation, believe that workers have dignity and that all work is dignified work. Millions of Latinx people hold up our country and our economy by working in every industry and in every sector in this nation. This was especially clear to all of us during the pandemic when so many members of our community were employed and continue to be employed in essential jobs. They put their lives on the line every day to keep this country running. Despite this reality, Latine workers, along with other workers, have faced and continue to grapple with exploitation, inequality in the workplace, and other barriers. These are the barriers that we are committed to addressing and removing so that all workers can thrive. And now, to help me set the framework for our conversation, please welcome my friend, Jose Garcia, Director at Ford Foundation of the Future of Workers.
Thank you, Mónica, and special thanks to the Latinx House for partnering with us on this important conversation today. There are 62 million Latinx people in the United States. The Latinx community is not a monolithic, as you all know, and as such, we don't have a singular story or experience. Philanthropy can play a critical role to shift the inaccurate and incomplete narrative about the Latinx community, just as philanthropy plays a crucial role in confronting the barriers, obstacles, and exploitation that Latinx and other workers face in our country. Through our grant making and platform, we have the opportunity to amplify and invest in organizations who are doing the work to change the conditions that the Latinx community face in achieving equity and dignity in work. What we understand as work in this country has changed significantly. Where we work, how we work, and even who is considered a worker for the existing legal and structural frameworks that exist in our country. There are thousands of workers, essential workers, like farm workers, day labor, domestic workers, and restaurant workers that have been denied some of the most basic worker protection in our country for decades. Latinx are overrepresented in lower sectors, and they are young workers and workers with disability who are legally allowed to be paid sub-minimum wage, not to mention workers in Puerto Rico that have been target of the control board as a way to cut costs of the state while using the worker pension to pay its debt. Today, there are emerging groups of workers who are similarly in precarious position, who are employed in our gig economy. Despite the many challenges, workers have been building power, organizing, and pushing for change and winning. Latinx workers are among those who are on the front lines of this fight, and Latinx organizers as well have been among some of the leading forces in winning justice for workers across our nation. Today, we have the honor of hearing from some of these incredible leaders to dig into where we are and what we must do to ensure that the future of work is equitable and just for all workers.
Thank you, Jose, and thank you all for joining us for this conversation. Now, let's welcome our panel and moderator.
To continue our critical conversation of the future of work in the Latinx community, welcome the Executive Director of Unemployed Workers United, Neidi Dominguez, the Interim Campaign Manager of Center for Popular Democracy, Julio López Verona, and the Executive Director of the Lift Fund, Jennifer Epps. And now, welcome today's moderator, staff writer at The Hill, Rafael Bernal.
Well, welcome to this wonderful conversation. And you saw that presentation on the introducing our wonderful panelists. We have to start off with we don't have them currently on air because they are at a conference and the lords of the internet are not helping. But we have a huge staff working to get them on. And as soon as they come on, I'll start asking them questions. I think we've got Julio coming up right now. There he is. Hey, Julio, how are you?
I am doing good. How are you?
I'm glad to see you. So, just one more housekeeping thing. We are going to have a Q&A session at the end of our conversation in about half an hour. So, start sending us your questions via message. You can send them ahead of time. You can send them if you think about them during the conversation, and we will try to get to all of them. Hopefully, we'll have a ton of questions to answer. But let's get right to it. This wonderful panel, as we said, that's been put together by the Latinx House. Julio, I'm gonna pick on you a little more till that conference allows us to have a full panel. But I really want to start on a positive note. So um, Hispanics, Latinx workers, we're all well known to have a strong influence in certain areas of the American economy. A lot of people associate, perhaps wrongly, Hispanic workers just to the agricultural sector or the construction sector. But that's a misconception. We're everywhere. Where do you think are some like highlights of where Hispanic workers have really helped or created new jobs, created new enterprise that are maybe overlooked?
Well, first, I would say that I think it's completely awesome that in many ways we are the people that are feeding and supporting our communities every day. Like when you think about Latinx workers, you think about the fact that while the pandemic was happening, we had hundreds of thousands of people that were in the fields, like putting their lives and their bodies, uh, uh, at risk to make sure that we all could stay in our homes. So I don't want to take away from the fact that the contributions that Latinx workers have done are completely important and amazing, and really have kept our country. In this case, I'm from a colony, so your country running. But at the same time, I would say that like the contributions of the Latinx community are throughout. Like I have family members that work in the nuclear regulatory administration. I have friends that work at SpaceX. When you think about Latinx communities, you really have to think about the fact that we are all over, and that we have, as a new, in many ways, immigrant community, have been taking a lot of jobs that in many cases are the jobs that you take when you are coming into a new community. But at the same time, these like fathers and mothers that have really had set the groundwork have now created a new space for new generations of entrepreneurs, of lawyers, of doctors. So I would take that with like a grain of salt. I think what we do right now is probably the most important thing that can be done, which is feeding us and taking care of us. But at the same time, I would say that we have seen how the contributions of Latinx workers can be seen like throughout like every sector of our community.
You make an excellent point, and I do want to pause on that, on sort of the contributions of the agricultural sector, especially in the work area, in the labor movement, and really in creating U.S. Latino community, Latinx community. It all came from the work, from the labor sector, right? It all, like the union of all of us as a community started in California. And so to talk to me a little bit about how that's grown from labor to sort of a social and political identity.
Well, I think that the fact that the like Latinx communities have in many ways started in low wage work jobs and like farms and others has really been kind of a driver of new organizing opportunities. You look at, for example, the exam like the Justice for Janitors campaign that happened 30 years ago, where you had all of these low wage sector workers that decided to organize and created like new and innovative ways to organize against companies that nobody thought could be done. And it was done because there is a sense of community that in many cases had been lost in other places. And people were able to kind of recognize the connections with their peers and actually organize in ways that have really like driven organizing for the last 30 years. I think there is a moment right now that is changing. Like we are seeing Amazon, we're seeing Starbucks, we're seeing Apple. But I would say for the last 30 years, it have been low wage workers. It has been like nursing jobs where that are in many cases like Black and brown people, the ones that are doing it. So when we think about like how community-based connections and how these low wage works have actually like created the opportunities for us to grow our organizing and our labor, there's no denying of the contributions that Latinx workers have had in this process.
Absolutely. And let's stick to the low wage jobs for a second. Low wage does not necessarily and often does not mean low productivity. And there's a huge overlap between wage and essential. That in itself seems to be a double injustice. But what are some possibilities for change to change conditions for low wage workers in the country?
Well, I would say I can come to like the thing that I'm working on right now. Like right now, we have in Puerto Rico about 50 to 60,000 low wage workers that are working in cleaning and security. And what we are doing is trying to connect the dots so that they can get organized and activated into building power. And we are seeing that throughout. Like we are seeing that in the auto industry. We are seeing that in the retail sector. So there are a lot of opportunities that are surging. And I would say that the pandemic has been really interesting because what we found was that there were workers that like suddenly understood their value. Like the notion of value has been the biggest notion and the biggest kind of incentivizer of union organizing. Like people started saying like my work, if I don't work, people die. And I think that when you look at like low wage workers and when you see that the fact that people started to understand that they were in the field where other people were at work and the value that that had for our community. And the fact that when we are in the like streets talking to people like when we talk about their value, su valor, people are starting to say like, I actually am worth more. That is driving union organizing, and that is coming from Latinx workers that were working while all of us were very much comfortable in our houses in many cases.
So I want to, you're getting ahead of all my questions in the best possible way because you mentioned Puerto Rico and I really wanted to ask you about Puerto Rico. There are a few exceptions in federal labor laws to the minimum wage. We're all very familiar with the servers exception. That's sort of been covered a lot, but there's also an exception for Puerto Rico for as part of its territorial status. How has that affected the sort of the labor market in Puerto Rico? And how is it, how's it affected workers in Puerto Rico?
So Puerto Rico is an interesting place. As you all know, we are a colony of the United States, which means that our laws are very much the laws that the U.S. Congress allows us to pass. Like we are under what the Constitution calls a territorial clause. Puerto Rico has been in a very different situation around minimum wage and workers' rights, like since its census as a colony of the U.S. We did not have the same minimum wage as the US until 1998. And over the last 10 years, as part of what has happened with the debt crisis, what we have seen is that there have been constant attacks on workers. There is a law that like oversees Puerto Rico that's called the Promesa Law. And that law specifically limits the ability that has the ability to lower workers' wages. But at the same time, there are many examples around like the attacks that Puerto Rican workers have had. We have seen cuts to services. We have seen extreme austerity measures. So Puerto Rico is in the same playing field when it comes to minimum wage in the U.S. But at the same time, there are exceptions that limit the ability that workers have to organize. And that's been the hardest part. Like you have a situation where you have incentives for rich people to come to the island, pay no taxes, and thrive, while you have working people that are in a position where they have to leave the island to survive.
A lot of movement of people. It's sort of all the because of that colonial status. Um, I want to jump over to our next topic here on wage theft. Um, is wage theft more prevalent in the Latina communities, and is that a factor of where most of our workers are? Is that a factor of discrimination, or is it sort of a little bit of all of the above? And what can we do to combat wage theft?
My experience with working in, for example, when I worked in Connecticut, we did a lot of work with workers that worked in the fields. And I don't have specific numbers, but I would say that we constantly saw wage theft. A very clear example of wage theft that happened with these members. In many cases, there is just like clear and blatant discrimination and abuse that's happening. So like there's a normalization of like just taking money from people because you think they are beneath you in some way or another. The practices are very informal. So if you have a worker that's working in the field and they're working 10 hours, you can, in many cases, like they get cheated around how much they get paid. In some cases, they are not paid for the time they spend traveling. So they spend 3 hours traveling to the place they're working, and then they come back, but they're only paid 8 hours. So I think that there is widespread wage theft in the Latinx community, and specifically in farm workers, as I've seen it. But it's a combination of like just clear discrimination and like the way in which these Latinx workers are seen, and just like practices that because they are informal, they lead to that. What we have done that has been extremely effective, like stopping some of that wage theft, is like just community or education. Like when I worked in Make the Road, Connecticut, we had weekly and sometimes even more trainings around like how to protect yourself, how to connect with a lawyer, how to make sure that you are getting paid what you can. And I think that the more that the community understands their rights, the easier it is for them to advocate for them. So it is a constant struggle, but it is a community struggle to make sure that people are educated and that they are fighting as much as they can to make sure that they are paid what they deserve and what they should be getting paid.
Follow up on that, as an advocate, how much harder is it to help a community when they're out of immigration status, or when a majority, when you have mixed status communities, when you put that extra factor in there of the broken immigration system, how much harder does that make your job?
I'm going to sound very hopeful, but I would say that the folks that have undocumented status tend to be the people that are willing and able to fight more than any other people that I've worked with. I hate that word, but the resiliency of the community, and the fact that people are coming and with a notion of like just building their families and building their homes, and understanding that they need to learn their rights and they need to learn how to advocate themselves. It is like for me as an organizer, it was always like what you were saying. It was like, if this is going to be hard, but it wasn't. Like people wanted to learn, people wanted to fight, and what they needed was the tools. And anytime we put a flyer saying like, we're going to have a lawyer and you're going to learn about your rights, like we would have 30 people there. I'm in Puerto Rico. I still get calls from people in Connecticut asking me about things. So I would say that the amazing resiliency and willingness to kind of like build a home that immigrant communities have makes them like the most wonderful and sometimes like heartbreaking people to work with. And I wouldn't have it any other way. I still work with that community. I love it.
Yeah, I mean, you saw that clearly in the 20 years of organizing that Dreamers have been doing, for starters.
Yeah.
I think it's a very clear. But we always think as the labor movement sort of in past tense. because I guess because it was in our history books when even when the old ones among us, like me, went to school. But there are still barriers, and there are sometimes growing barriers, is my understanding, to organizing workers and getting them to know and, more importantly, exercise their right. What kind of barriers have you found in sort of implementing and teaching fair labor practices?
I would say one of the biggest barriers we found is the like literal disdain for unions. Like there has been, and that's changing very quickly. But when I started organizing, like talking about unions was in many cases like talking about the boogeyman. And I think that notion about like that notion that the like in many cases the right has done very effectively at building a case around unions as like they take your dues or they don't advocate for you has and was entrenched in people's minds for a long time. And what we've seen, I think, after the pandemic and with what's been happening with workers racing is that is changing very quickly. And then, there's the normal fears of people. They are like they fear losing their jobs. They fear losing their ability to survive, to provide for their families. Like when you are organizing workers, you really have to kind of like not only be a person that breaks those fears, but also like helps them feel supported. And in many cases, the thing that has been the challenge and the solution for that is like actually like doing one-on-one organizing. Like there's been like the rise of the digital organizing, the rise of all of this, but it's really like talking to people one-on-one, like understanding their issues and moving them to action, the thing that's going to always get you the goods. So breaking through that those false notions about what a union is, what the movement is, and like pushing them to actually like understand their value. We were talking about value like a little while ago, and understand that they can push for more, and like actually like looking at their value in the pandemic and in this moment has been very effective at getting people to kind of push through and organize.
I guess let's move this a little bit toward accountability. Who, of course, workers need to organize, and workers often organize, not always, but often organize. There are many groups that try to get them to organize. Our community has shown a lot of, you said you hated this word. I know why. I agree with you. So it's shown a lot of resiliency in organizing at the labor level, at the political level, sometimes for specific causes like immigration. But who's ultimately accountable to create the pathways for workers to successfully execute and exercise their rights that they have in federal statute, for starters, and then and then a lot of state and local legislation as well.
That's a tricky question. If you tell me like that workers have to find their power and move into action, I would say like sure, yes. But we know that in the like my experience with organizing both in the union and the community sector is that people find their power when you provide them like the ability to do so. And I think that means that there has to be a concerted effort from people that have the know-how, in some cases that have the education, to provide those tools and to kind of like provide the hope that's needed. And it is a balance. Like we will, when we are knocking on doors, knock on 100 doors and maybe find two people that are like the leaders that are gonna be awesome. And then when you find them, those are the people that become better than you. Those are the people that then they're like, who's Julio? Like I am leading this and I am doing it. Like we have seen that, for example, in the Amazon organizing that has been happening, where like the efforts that in some cases traditional unions it did not work. But then there was a sector of like just community members that decided we want to organize, and we should kind of like treat that as a balance between the like the base of good organizing and good education that was created, and the ability that workers had to learn that, to build their power and to move forward. So I'm not gonna say it's complicated. There's no like one answer.
That's fair. You mentioned the word traditional unions, or the term traditional unions. What to you makes a traditional union, and are unions the fundamental tool, the only tool, a tool for workers to organize and get their rights?
I don't think so. Right now in Puerto Rico, I am working with a community organization that is talking to workers about their power. And if workers eventually want to build that power into something, that is going to be what they do. So there are ways in which, from a community organizing kind of like opportunity, you can build union power. There are ways in which, like, all workers can decide to organize themselves in other structures that could be similar to unions but are not. I think that when I say traditional unions, it might be because, in some cases, unions are very white and very male driven, and they are not necessarily representative of Latin workers or Black workers. So I think that the learnings of good union organizing practices are there, but the fact that workers are organizing by themselves and finding more innovative ways to kind of organize and build are telling us something about the future of unions and where unions are going.
Okay, so we do have now Jennifer. She's joining us for the final stretch of this conversation. So I know I picked a lot on you, Julio. But not sorry about that. Uh, now it's your turn, Jennifer. And just before asking you a question, I want to remind the audience that now is a really good time to start sending in your questions. Just putting them in the messages, and we'll I'll get Julio and Jennifer to answer them for you. Um, so I guess we've been talking. You know this conversation, Jennifer. Welcome, first of all. Um, I think where the conversation that we've been having is leading us to is, what needs to be done to sort of shift the trajectory of where workers' rights are going today. That's not in 100% positive. It's not 100% negative. But what do we do to sort of make that arc bend toward a positive movement for workers?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I apologize. We've been having tremendous tech issues today, but I'm glad I get to at least come in on this part, which is probably my favorite, right? Like how we talk about worker organizing, how we talk about expanding workers' rights. So just a tiny bit about me when and sort of my worldview of where my background is coming. My grandparents are uh, immigrants from Honduras. They're Afro Indigenous Latinx, and they have come here because they came here, and they're of the Garifuna people, and they came here because they wanted an opportunity for their children and for their grandchildren to be able to uh, really figure out how to provide and take care of us and get opportunities that they didn't have at home. And so understanding that and the fact that they were both low wage workers, my grandfather was a bellman and my grandmother was a home care worker, both having opportunities here in the United States, one having an opportunity to be in a union, and actually both of them being in a union and having pensions and having benefits and things that they came to this country for and was able to have a good retirement. And I think the trajectory changed for them by having a good job, right? By having a job with a union contract, by having rights on the job and being able to have a voice. And so, with that understanding for me, and then also organizing workers for the last prior to this role for the last 16 years has really led me to believe that, you change the trajectory to having good jobs where people have dignity in all the work that they do, whether they're a home care worker or they're a nurse or any person in a institution, and that they have respect and that they're paid well and have the benefits that they need, and also having a voice on the job. So I think those are the ways that we are able to transform work, particularly for low wage workers, for Latinx communities, and all workers really.
So it's basically coming down to given jobs of dignity that they deserve.
Yep,
But so
absolutely.
so in that process of giving dignifying labor, um, the of course the labor movement can play a huge role. Individual workers, we talked about how not necessarily through unions, sometimes through community organizing, through a whole series of different tools. But where do we see the most active in your view cross movement solidarity? Where I don't know if the immigration like immigration and labor are cooperating, or political movements or grassroots movement. Where do you see the best the cross movement solidarity?
Well, particularly coming to the Lyft Fund, I think that's what one of the things that I was gravitated to is the fact that at the Lyft Fund we were able to put folks who are normally not together in the room making decisions and resourcing places. So a collaborative fund like the Lifts, which you have labor and you have philanthropy and you have movement at the table, I think we're able to pick out in a lot of places where this kind of work is happening, and it's cross generational, it's intersecting. And particularly our work now is going to be in the South, and where we're seeing a lot of folks, there's this emergence of demographics changing, and not just having Black folks, but Latinx communities. And I see that, in some of the grantees that we've been able to fund, where you have really strong partnerships with traditional, maybe white unions and Latinx organizations that have been really able to figure it out and not just talk about immigration, but talk about workers' rights and talk about all the things that make a whole worker, right? And so I think there's another piece that's happening as well, that there is folks who are really thinking about how to not make labor the standalone issue and community a standalone issues, and de-siloing them and making sure that we're not just talking about work, but we're talking about education, we're talking about healthcare, we're talking about all the voter ranks, all the things that matter to all of our communities. And so that I think is the way forward, and particularly excited because Lyft does a lot of that.
Excellent. Well, I have excellent news. Neidi Dominguez is here. We've overcome our technical difficulties, our scheduling. So welcome, first of all, Neidi.
Thank you. I'm so glad that it worked out.
Me too. So I want to remind the audience, send in your questions. Now we have a full panel to answer them, which is great. But Nate, I want to, throughout this conversation, we've touched on a lot of different sort of different structural challenges for workers, and specifically for Latinx workers to, exercise their rights. But I I've been wondering, like, what is the diversity of challenges? Is the division rural and urban? Is it national origin? Is it geographical? Is it state by state? I wonder what to you are the biggest challenges in sort of looking at our community's labor conditions as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're all the things that you just named. Certainly, the issues that workers that work in a rural setting versus workers in an urban setting are going to be very different, right? But there are some common themes that I do think our community is feeling all across the country when it comes to their rights and how they're showing up and feeling empowered in the workplace. And I think the number one of them is that question of, do they feel empowered to demand for better working condition in their workplaces? And I think that's an issue that is affecting the Latino community and Latino workers, because just like all the other workers, we don't have good laws in this country that actually really truly protect workers when they speak up and they want to organize in the workplace. So things like passing the PRO Act and just reforming our labor laws that they don't exclude farm workers and domestic workers from having the same rights as every other worker in this country are crucial. But further than that, protecting them, that when they are part of organizing efforts, when they do demand for better working conditions, that if they're fired, that they could be protected, that there are things that the government and local governments can do to actually be on the side of the worker and not on the side of the employers by default of because of how broken our laws are. So I think that's a common theme. Like if workers actually felt that they were protected, they would be way more emboldened and empowered to just demand for more, because our communities, they know that we deserve more, right? Like 100% of the times when I work with workers, with day laborers, with domestic workers, with car wash workers, with construction workers, and they're Latino, they know when something is wrong in the workplace. They know they are being exploited. They know that it's an unsafe workplace. And it's not that they don't know that keeps them from speaking up, is that they also know that then when they speak up, very little can be done to protect them. And that's a problem, right? And it gets even worse when we're talking about immigrant workers and undocumented workers, that for them, it's not just the concern about losing their jobs, but for many of them, when they are undocumented workers in a construction site, right? For example, even when there's federal funds involved, because we have such broken immigration laws too, and very little connection between labor and immigration, like my sister Jennifer was speaking about, workers that speak up are very worried that they're going to get deported, and rightfully so, right? We are thankfully we have an administration now that we believe does want to do better than what we've done in the past. But in the last decade or so, even under a Democratic administration, we saw millions of our people be deported, and we've seen many workers be deported because of workplace raids, and that's a problem, right? And so if workers see that, well, I did the right thing, I did speak up, I collaborated with the labor agency, and still I am facing deportation, or still I was deported and there's nothing that can be done to protect me, then what's the message that we're sending, not just to our community and workers that are Latinx, but to all workers, right? And
So
so
I
I
want
would say
to.
that those are the major
Yeah.
ones.
I want to. So you brought this up, and earlier in the conversation, I asked Julio about this, and in a second we'll bring all three of you in for a broader question. But on the intersection of labor rights and immigration, in your experience, how much more difficult has it been to advocate for workers who have to deal with a migration status, whether it's undocumented or whether it's a temporary status, or even whether it's a permanent residency that does have restrictions that people sometimes don't know about? How much harder does that make your job?
It makes it so much harder because we can't actually have any guarantees to the workers that they're going to be protected, right? And so it doesn't stop workers from organizing. I also want to name that, I think all of us here in this panel know how resilient and how powerful our communities are, even when they've been so marginalized and disenfranchised. And that's true for Latinx workers too in this country. They are still organizing, they're still fighting every day, even when they're not protected. But it makes the job of an organizer or any organizing drive much harder when we cannot tell a worker, listen, you are right to speak up. You should have more rights. You have these rights. But if something happens, I can't guarantee that you're going to be safe. And so I think it really dampens a lot of the potential, especially for workers that are trying to both create better conditions for everyone in their industries, but for workers that are trying to organize into a union, right? And I think thinking about how that affects our community is one thing, but that how that affects the economy and the future of the labor movement in this country. As we know, we are the biggest, fastest growing minority in the country, it should concern all of us, right? To think about how are we actually setting up more of our communities to have good jobs, to have good union jobs, because we know, statistically, Latinx workers are a part of a union versus in any industry, versus a worker that is not part of a union sees at least a 20% decrease in their wages or even more, depending in the industry. By default, if our people are in a union, our people are doing way better. And so I am 100% in support of any efforts to try to get our people into unions, because I know that that will make it so that they will earn more, that they will be safer, that they will become homeowners, because that's what the math and the statistics shows us already. We already know what's one of the solutions.
All right, so I want to pick on our audience a second more to bring in your questions. We're almost at the end of this fantastic panel, but now that I have all three of you on screen, feel free to talk over each other. I want to ask a question, like a sort of an open ended question, and given all that we've said about the lack of action the last 25 years on the part of Congress, the few chances for changing legislation, considering the political reality we live in today, what's one change that any of you think that could shift the trajectory in the right direction for workers and for achieving fair wages? I can pick that. Hey, there you
Yeah.
go.
Okay, yeah. I was gonna say, I mean, you know, I I try really hard not to be a pessimist. So I think that like the most obvious thing that comes up for me is in Congress passing the PRO Act and the Power Act are two pieces of legislation that would be it would just change completely the field of how Latinx workers are actually now being protected, empowered into organizing. So I think at the federal level, we have those pieces of legislations there. They've been there for a long time. I we're gonna keep on fighting, and I hope that they pass. But I also know that it will be really hard for that to happen. And so I think at the local level, it really comes down to organizing. It really comes down to figuring out new ways to actually put our community at the forefront, both for us, but reminding our friends and family and our communities that if we do better, if we can have Black workers do better, then we're going to do better. If they and us can do better along with Indigenous people, then everyone else is going to do better. And that we are part of the solution. We are absolutely part of the solution.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I agree so much with what Neidi said. I think that there's a couple of things that we're doing now that if we could just turn up the heat on it, it would be so much more effective and to be able to do it at scale. I think one of the things that Nadi's organization and Julio's organization does is really bring in that organization that allows for workers to have some place to go, particularly workers that don't have an opportunity to be in a union. And so the more that we're able to fund those kinds of organizations so that they can work on building power within our communities, I think the better off we'll be in terms of being able to organize for various things. I think about we went to Nashville recently and workers' dignity and how we think about their work and really, having less of a fear factor when it comes to folks standing up together because they're all in it together. I think folks being able to have an easier time organizing, which whatever policies the Department of Labor can put into place or the not so much the Department of Labor, but the National Labor Relations Act can be tweaked to be able to allow for folks to have recourse if they are retaliated against or targeted. You asked for one thing, and there's so many things, but I think so. That's just to start.
Okay, Julio, what's on the top of your letter to Santa Claus? How would you start?
I think, truthfully, we need more foundations to give us more money so that we can get more boots on the ground and organize. We are in a critical moment. And I'll say this again. Like, this is a moment where workers understand their value much more than they have in a long time. And this is a moment where if we can be proactive about, like, not digital, like outreach or text messages, none of that, thing. Like, we need people to actually talk to other people, to have conversations about, like, the fact that during the pandemic, Latinx workers, like, actually, like, helped us survive. And they should be in a position where they have power. And people, like, like our friend was saying, like, people understand that. They understand their value in this moment. The more that we can do and the more proactive we can be about, like, getting them the tools they need to understand how to organize, the rest is easy. Amazon workers organize by themselves. I don't care. Let them organize by themselves. We don't need big unions. Big unions are great and they should be pushing this, but we should also, like, make sure that Black and brown workers are being led and are creating organizations, whether it be unions or whatever, that are leading the next fight and the next frontier of union organizing. So one, we need more money. Two, we need to make sure that unions or whoever's giving that money is letting Black and brown folks lead. And three, we need to stop texting and reposting on Instagram, and we actually need to be talking to people on the ground, face to face.
Okay, so we're almost at the end of this, and so before we go to closing arguments or closing statements, this isn't a court case, although it well could be, I suppose. Before we go to closing statements, one last question coming in, sort of last minute, like we like them. I'd like each of you, same order, give me an example of, either one investment or one experience organizing, whether it's an industry, a city, a community, whatever that is sort of giving you hope that things are improving or can improve.
I mean, I think one of the investments I see every day is workers, workers really helping themselves, right? And I agree with Julio that ultimately the only way that we're going to do this is actually empowering and giving more access and resources to workers themselves to do that. I will use the example of, for example, families in Harris County, Texas, in Houston, Texas, where during the pandemic we started organizing them digitally, right? In a moment where people weren't, lost their jobs. We started talking to folks that lost their jobs during COVID in 2020 and eventually started going back to the workforce. And we started hearing the horror stories from them about how staffing agencies and temp agencies were so discriminatory and exploitative, right? And in the process of figuring out, like, what can we do about these staffing agencies, which is the fight that we're in right now in Houston, Texas, we also were able to use the resources that we did have, even at a virtual level because it was COVID, and even the city council of of Houston, Texas wasn't even meeting in person. We had an opportunity to push for an eviction moratorium. Our people were really worried about not being able to keep their homes because they had lost their jobs, right? And so we were able to use tech tools and digital tools to actually be able to engage 15,000 people, turn out hundreds of them to a city council meeting that was being done only virtually to push for an eviction moratorium. And we won, right? And we won in partnership with many local organizations like FIEL and Workers Defense Project. And those are the same people that are now fighting now and really shaping what are we going to do about these staffing agencies. So also just thinking about, like, investing in workers as a whole, right? Workers are parents. They are community members. They go to church. They worry about whether they're going to have food on the table and a roof on top of their heads. And so when we're organizing with them and along with them, we have to be able to kind of like walk and chew gum at the same time and listen to the issues that are going to move them. And that's all part of building power together.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I agree with Neidi. I think, and to add, I think there's two parts that I would add to the conversation about the investments that need to be made. One, I would say, obviously, the investments in organizations that are Black and brown led, that are actually making differences in their communities that are transformative, and sort of really being intentional about that, particularly for foundations. I think that is one way of moving us forward and actually making the investments that are going to be needed to organize. I also think one of my experiences just as an organizer and being able to use and leverage the collective bargaining agreement to be able to bring more people to the table was game changing, right? And so organizations that talked about immigration and talked about healthcare and talked about parents and it brought faith community in, and it brought all these other players in to leverage our process of collective bargaining, was the way where we were able to gain momentum and win for everyone, not just the bread and butter issues that happen at a negotiations table. So I think the more organizations that are built and supported to have capacity to be a part of different tables and coalitions, I think those kinds of investments really matter and pay dividends later when it's time to all come together, whether it's a union issue or a community power issue or any issues that may come up, but folks are ready and willing to do that because they've been invested in and have the capacity to do that.
Okay, Julio, you get to close it up.
Started, I get to finish.
There you go.
I would say, like, I'm thinking about Sonia Palacios, who is a leader that we identified about 3 years ago when pensions were going to be cut in Puerto Rico. And Sonia was like, I'm going to do this and we're going to build it. And we built a list of about 10,000 retirees that went into an assembly. 1,000 retirees went into assembly and decided they were going to fight for their rights and fight to make sure that their pensions were not being get cut. And 3 years later, we literally won to like the U.S. Congress and to the Puerto Rico legislature, and we're able to protect their pensions. And now they're fighting for not only for their pensions, but also for workers' rights and for to make sure that we stop the gentrification of Puerto Rico. So I think that leaders like Sonia are the thing that give me hope about like the future of worker organizing, and also like the legacy of worker organizing, because Sonia's a retiree who's like now building with like new folks, worker power, so we can all live with dignity, and that's awesome.
Well, that's sadly all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank you all for being on this great panel. My feeling when I talk to organizers like you is there's just so much talent and so much connection to communities that's available to grow, and that's what makes me hopeful. That there is all that tapped and untapped potential. But so thank you so much for being here, and I hope you catch this episode and the next one.
This concludes today's critical conversation, the future of work in the Latinx community. Thank you for joining us. We invite you to tune in for episode 5, the impact of incarceration and the criminal justice system on Latinx communities, on July 12th at 1 p.m. Eastern. Critical Conversations is a Latinx learning series powered by the Latinx House and Ford Foundation with support from Hispanics in Philanthropy.